Hi, good morning everyone. It's really lovely to be here. I didn't realise Morecambe was so pretty. I've not been here for a few years. Beautiful scenery and the beach is tempting. Maybe I might pop down afterwards and look at the sea. So I just want to speak to you about the work in Preston, and I've done this presentation many times to many different people, to many audiences, and I think we're hitting on something that is quite special, and it's nothing special about Preston as a place, but basically a set of ideas, because we feel we're responding to austerity. And you've got to look how austerity was caused, because it was caused because of the financial crisis, and I'll come on to that a bit later on. But these ideas are potentially quite transformative if they're brought to scale. So if we just start through the slides, we'll go back to 2007. So that was 12 years ago now. So there's a situation in 2007 where, out of nowhere, we had the huge economic meltdown that saw the banks being bailed out by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Alistair Darling, at the time. And that was unexpected. Everything we were told by pretty much everyone, politicians, civil servants, business people, was that the economy is working for all of us, it's efficient, it's stable, and we're going to benefit from the way it operates. But then we had that economic crash of 2007. And we can't underestimate the devastation that's caused, because every family within this room and across the country had to pay £20,000 to bail out the economy. So obviously a lot of that money we got back, but that was the amount of money used to support the banking system. And it wasn't just a UK situation or a Northwest situation, it was a worldwide situation, and it goes back to 40 years of neoliberal economics. So it is a deregulation of the financial sector, it is privatisation of assets, it's all led to that bubble which burst. So despite all our money being used to bail out the financial system, and it happened in America as well as here and other European countries, austerity has been the result. So the quite devastating effects of austerity, and there's estimates there's been 130,000 lives lost because of the public sector shrinking so much and the services and benefits being cut. Because of that, we've had the austerity, and that's meant that things aren't getting better. The cuts that we faced as a council, we're just a large district council, but we had 30 odd million in 2010 to spend on the community. That's now down to just over 20 million. And that was unprecedented, and some of the decisions we had to make, we never thought we'd have to make. And this challenges democracy, because ultimately if you vote for a political party, whether it's Labour, Lib Dem, Conservatives, Green or whoever, you expect them to deliver political choices for you, either at a local or a national level. And austerity has actually reigned in that democracy, that in many ways democracy is becoming less relevant and less meaningful, and that it should be a concern to us all. So all our money's been used to bail out the financial system in the UK, and then despite that, we still see a situation where inequality is rising. We still see a situation where the large banks, they won't lend often to local businesses and even some individuals. And the economy now, it's brinkering on going into another recession. So this is really, it's very big picture stuff. I don't understand that, but it's very much something we've got to respond to. And if you don't face up to these challenges at every single level, then we're not representing the communities that we're here to present at a political level or through a health field. People's lives are going to be less healthy because it's inequality which leads to lots of ill health outcomes. So if we move on to the next slide. Preston, up until about 6 or 7 years ago, we did the conventional things that most councils did of all political colours. We tried to bring in inward investment, that was our primary purpose. So we tried to bring mainly lots of large companies, retail investment mainly into the city centre. And for nearly 15 years within Preston, we tried to bring about a regeneration scheme. So this started in the late 90s, and this was going to be using two of the largest developers on the planet. So one was Lend-Lease, and the other one was Grosvenor, which is a Duke of Westminster's company, who was at the time the wealthiest individual in the UK. And the idea is that half our city centre will be put into a vehicle which would be half owned by the council and half owned by the developer. And then that would bring in John Lewis, it would have brought in other retail developments, it would have brought in housing, restaurants, cinemas, and that's what Preston would have looked like there. And again, this was problematic. So even when we started doing this and got into it in the mid-noughties, and I had my own reservations about it, but I wasn't on the council when it started. even when we started doing this, there were some issues, and then the economic crash came, and then the main anchor store, John Lewis, it pulled out of that development. So 2011 was when the Labour Party, which is my party, which I'm now proud to lead a Labour council in Preston, we took control, and I was in the cabinet. So we had a situation where big business didn't want to come into our city centre and invest into our economy, and also government's cutting back. So you're in a straitjacket, really, that you've managed well, very excited because we're back in control, we want to do things for people, we want to make big changes, but ultimately, big business doesn't want to come in, and the amount of cash we have from government is significantly cut back. So we thought we're going to try and take control in a very positive way. So we've got a series of ideas now, which is now known as the Preston Model. And this is a concept known as economic democracy. So it's trying to make sure there's more democracy in our local economy. So people, institutions, businesses have more of a say over what happens. So instead of trying to be dependent on larger corporations coming in and singing to their tune, we're taking control by actually doing things in our own way. And these are a set of ideas. Some of them are at a Preston level, but many are at a Lancashire level, so they can be applied here. And we feel putting these together is transformative. We also think that lots of the media attention we're getting, which is very positive, and obviously putting Preston on the map, it's because we're doing things differently. We've actually had the courage to actually say, well, we're going to try to do things in our own way. So I'll just talk you through these ideas, and then I'll go on to some international examples of where I feel these ideas actually work very well. So within Preston, we're very lucky because what we have is we have anchor institutions. So these are things like NHS trusts, hospitals, local government, police forces, housing associations, further education colleges. And unlike conventional companies, they're not going to disappear from the community. They're going to be rooted within Preston. They're going to be anchored within Preston. So we realised, and we started working with a fantastic think tank called Cllr. We realised that these organisations in Preston, they're spending, just the initial 6 that we had, they're spending nearly £1 billion on goods and services every single year. And the thing that was a bit strange about this is that all this wealth is in these institutions, and they're not looking at where they're buying the goods and services from. Are they buying it from Preston-based suppliers? Are they going to potentially buy it from cooperative businesses that aren't going to get up and leave? Are they going to get a living wage and apprentices into the contracts? So what we've done is we're working now with about 10 or 11 anchor institutions, and I think the collective spend of these anchor institutions, and a lot of these are at Lancashire level as well, it's going to be over 2 billion now. So we've been working with them to increase spend to local suppliers. So that's suppliers based within Preston and Lancashire. And crucially, that's going to be an emphasis on local businesses and cooperatives, small businesses, because they're more likely to create more jobs and also keep more wealth within the local economy. So I'll come on to that a bit later, but that's been very successful. We also realised that sitting within Lancashire is a pension fund worth £7 billion. And that's 120 public sector employees that actually are part of that pension fund. So it's the councils in Lancashire, the county, the districts, the unitaries. It's also further education colleges. There's other organisations as a part of that pension fund. And what was strange about that is that 7 billion as it is now, I think the last direct investment in Lancashire was in something like 1962. So as part of our city deal, we approached the fund and said, well, listen, aren't you going to consider trying to invest a bit of this locally within Preston and South Ribble, which is our city deal area, and Lancashire as well? And again, there's now 200 million which is going to be invested in Lancashire. 100 million in Preston and South Ribble, and another 100 million in wider Lancashire. And obviously, we want to go further in Preston Council to do that. We want to look at a Lancashire Wealth Fund, so you can pool that investment with assets, physical assets, and other investments from the public sector and potentially private sector. So you've got a pool of wealth that's more democratically controlled. So it's controlled by the people within our community about where they'd like to invest. I'm a bit geeky, as you can probably tell, but there's one thing you do tonight. Please look up Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, and that is the largest network of cooperative businesses in the world, and they're headquartered in Spain, in the Basque Country. And they are the largest, the network of 100 businesses, and crucially, they're all owned by the people who work there. So they all worker cooperatives, so they're owned by the employees. So basically, the bosses, they decide who the bosses are. You know, we're conditioned to think we've got to work for an employer. These are democratic companies where they decide what happens within those companies. And if you're talking about health outcomes, there's been studies done, and where there's communities in Europe where you've got a very high propensity of cooperative businesses, worker-owned businesses, things like life expectancy within those communities are 1.5 to 2 years longer. The pay of people who work in those businesses are 20 or 30% better than shareholder-owned firms. The ratio between top and bottom are between 1 and 6. So you don't have a situation where the chief executive might be receiving 5 or 6 million while the cleaner's on £8.21 an hour. So we've been quite inspired by Mondragon and other cooperative economies. So we're working to establish a number of worker co-ops within Preston. We got 3 already. 2 have been incubated, the other one's in the pipeline, but we want a number of these worker-owned businesses. And we're working with our university and our cooperative development network in Preston to incubate worker co-op businesses, and hopefully they can then supply the local public sector, especially when there's wealth leaking out, especially to corporations that are headquartered in Greater London and the South East, and a lot of that public wealth ends up in a tax haven somewhere. I mentioned about the banks and the damage that they caused, the large banks. So we're working to establish a Lancashire Community Bank, and this is very exciting. And this is going to be across Lancashire, and we're looking at having a wider footprint as well across Merseyside and Cumbria to give it the sufficient scale it needs. And this North West Community Bank, what it will do is it'll be fully licensed. And we've never had in this country regional cooperative banks. We had the Cooperative Bank, which was national and part of the cooperative group, but we've never had regional cooperative banks. And crucially, that's going to lend to a lot of local businesses who have difficulty accessing finance, because the reality is if you're a charity or a small business, you want to access £10,000 or £20,000, often the large banks won't lend to you because you'd rather lend to other banks and other large companies. Or even if you're an individual, if you're in a certain postcode which is deprived, often you can't get a current account. So our bank's going to be fully licensed, and we're going to envisage that bank will be lending £500 million in the 8th year. So this is very system-changing stuff, but it is a response to austerity, because communities where they have these banking arrangements, they weather economic storms a lot better, and more wealth is kept in the economy, and the tax base is up because of that. So if we move on. And then also, we're very keen on expanding the real living wage of £9 an hour, which is significantly above the government's minimum wage. And we want to be a living wage city. So we're trying to get our anchor institutions and also our football club and other people, institutions that are going to be there to become living wage employers. So far we've got 60 living wage employers, and that's had a real benefit on lifting people out of poverty pay. But obviously we want to go a lot further and encourage a lot of private companies to do that as well. We are one of a number of councils where we've had to divest our housing stock a number of years back. We're looking at how the council could form a company, potentially with one of our housing associations, which is a cooperative, to create a company to deliver affordable housing again. We have a planning system which is quite effective, and we have a policy that says that all developments, whether it's public or private sector, over a certain size, we encourage them to take on people in levels of high unemployment and deprivation, and try to give them jobs with the job centre and other partners, but also use local suppliers. So again, if there's large developments in Preston, then the community's benefiting from it. And then we've got to look forward about new technologies, and a lot of the emerging technologies are things around IT, it's about the ageing population, but crucially it's about things like drone technology, because the drone technology market in 2030, that'll be worth 32 billion to the UK economy. So we're working with our university business school to establish a civic drone centre, so those drones can be supplied to the police force, because criminals are caught these days. If you've pinched a bicycle, the drone clocks you and actually identifies you. Drones monitor air developments, they can deliver medical supplies, and we're saying we want that technology to be produced within Lancashire with British Aerospace and other small companies, because currently it's China which exports the drones. So those are the ideas that have come out of the Preston model. As you can see, when they're put together, we're kind of like freeing ourselves from a failed economic model that's let us down for so long. And we're doing that at a local and regional level. So it's really exciting, and it's beginning to get results. So I'll just show you more examples about how we can have healthier, more democratic economies. On the left is a German banking system. It's called the Sparkassen, and on the right is the Bank of North Dakota. In Germany, when that dreadful crash came in 2008, were community banks called the Sparkassen, not-for-profit charitable banks, predominated in local economies, whether that was at a city, town and village level, they were lending to small businesses whilst the taxpayer was bailing out the large banks. And they actually avoided recession because they had that banking model within that community. North Dakota has a bank that's actually owned by the public sector, and it's been there for 100 years. It was initially set up to support the agricultural community in, I think, 1919. And they got a situation where over 80% of businesses and individuals actually use that bank, and it's devolved down to the community. And when that economic crash came to America in 2008, unemployment was at 40% of the rest of America because they found a way of actually creating wealth and capturing it within that region. And they were very resilient. So we're saying that these alternatives do actually work, that there are alternatives to the current neoliberal form of organising economies. So we're working on the Northwest Community Bank, and that's what it's going to look like. Please try and encourage anyone who you know in your institutions to invest in it, whether that's a council or potentially, I'm not sure if the NHS could invest in a bank like that, but it would basically get great jobs for people and they'd have healthier lives. And it's going to have staff branches, satellite branches, it's going to be on the internet, you can deposit money there, and it's going to obviously have current accounts. And we're saying that's crucial because if we don't get to the heart of the matter, that the current austerity economics did come from a major part of the way that the large financial institutions behaved, then we're not really getting to the heart of the issue. We're just going to be skirting around at the edges. So we're working at Preston, we're working with Wirral and Liverpool, and Lancaster Council are now showing interest as well, and other councils to establish this bank. And what will happen is it'll be capitalised with £20 million. It's going to reopen some of the branches that have disappeared from the high street because a lot of the larger banks are actually withdrawing from our high street. And obviously, once it gets a full banking licence, that 20 million can be £500 million. And again, that's just on a very cautious assumption of 2% switching the bank accounts to this community bank. So again, that's an example of how we're taking these examples from abroad, which actually do work very well. I mentioned about the public sector pension fund. On the left's another American example, that's Alabama. They've just put 10% of their public pension fund in that region into developing quite conventional things like hotels, golf courses, office space. And on the right is the results you get just by investing 10% in your regional economy. So shifting some of that wealth away from speculative investments in Wall Street in this instance, and just investing it in conventional development within that regional economy. And that's what you get. And that's a way of fighting austerity, because the returns are 28 billion of GDP for the state, 14.3 billion of earnings, and nearly 300,000 jobs directly and indirectly over those 22 years. So obviously, if we go on to the next slide, our pension fund is invested in Preston, and we're very proud of that. And this was one of the largest developments at the time within the city, actually, because of the Tideborne project I mentioned before, which was stalled. So that's what Friargate looked like on the left, which is one of our main streets. It was very run down. Now the pension fund have spent £80 million developing and now owning some student flats. And interestingly, on that development, there was a local company used, Eric Wright, and they're now a charitable organisation. They're a construction company, and 200 jobs created, and people are paying council tax, the businesses are paying business rates, you get a virtuous cycle of activity, the fund's getting the return that it needs. I mentioned about the spending upwards, because out of the 6 anchor institutions that we engaged with originally in 2013, despite all that wealth in our communities, they were spending just 5% within Preston. By 2017, that was 18%. So there's been a huge cultural shift to get them to buy from more locally based organisations, including local businesses. And just in that 1 year, and it takes a long time to actually go through the books of these institutions to actually get these figures, but just in the 1 year, that was an extra 75 million spent within the Lancashire, in the Preston economy. And they reckon that's equivalent to an extra 1,600 jobs. So a lot of these sectors, it's been, especially construction, going to local construction companies. And a lot of our local construction companies that are family-owned, they'll have 100, 150 subcontractors, which again, small Preston-based companies, scaffolders, all the rest of it. And again, it's filtering through there as well. And across Lancashire, that was the spend doubled, and that was an extra 200 million spent within Lancashire. And that's estimated, putting that money back into the economy, it's an extra 4,500 jobs. So that's our first worker co-op. It's called the Larder. If you've ever been in Preston, please visit it and have a sandwich or soup or whatever they serve. I think they've changed the menu, so I need to go back in very recently. But those are the people who are working in the worker cooperative, and that's outside our town hall. And the idea that's going to scale up and bid for contracts from the local public sector that's leaking out to large corporations. So obviously it's going to be done through fair and open competition, but say that cooperative won a contract worth £1 million, say feeding NHS patients, there'd be 3 times as many members in it. And potentially they could be working, or you could locate the cooperative potentially, if they won contracts like that, in the most deprived areas where life expectancy is low. So all these things can be done, but there tends to be, what I found throughout my political career, which has been quite long, is you tend to get institutional resistance. So when you come up with new ideas which are potentially quite transformative like that, people don't like them and they find ways to not do them. But obviously these things can be done and they need to be done, because obviously we've all got a responsibility to make sure that we look after people out there. Second worker cooperative, it's called Preston Digital Foundation. That's UCLan graduates which have created a worker-owned company, which is obviously IT. They potentially might have gone to Manchester or Liverpool or London, they're staying in Preston and they're working in the co-op. And again, I think that's looking to supply the university as well to some degree. So that's very positive. And I mentioned about the real living wage. If you look at the, one of the reasons people don't live as long or are not as healthy is that they're in poverty. And we've got a situation now where a lot of people are in poverty or in work. So what we've done is we've been actively and very aggressively promoting the real living wage. Preston Council was the first living wage employer in 2012 in the north of England. We've now got over 45 organisations that pay it in Preston. And this was 2011 when we took control. So wage levels in Preston for part-time employees, for people who work there, they were £143.60, and that was below the North West and Great Britain average. 6 years later, we've been promoting the living wage, getting public sector and private sector organisations to pay it, and as far as legally possible, encouraging them to bring that into procurement as well. For part-time employees working in Preston, we're now significantly above the North West and Great Britain average for 12 councils in Lancashire, and we're the best there. And that's a really important issue, because women especially tend to be, because they've got caring responsibilities, they tend to be in part-time employment, as do BME community. So it's an equalities issue as well, lifting people out of low pay. So all these ideas put together, they've contributed, it's not all down to these, but they've contributed to us being independently assessed the most improved city in the UK out of 42 cities by PricewaterhouseCoopers Demos in the Index of Economic Wellbeing. So if we move on, as you see there, red is Preston, so we've significantly outperformed the other improving cities, or some of the cities are actually going backwards in terms of things like income distribution, health, jobs especially, work-life balance, skills, housing affordability. So as a Labour Council leader, I'm very proud of that these indicators are about trying to create a more equitable local economy, and all these ideas put together have contributed to that. But obviously, these ideas are now springing up in other places, and we're learning from other communities about how we can implement them. So just some examples of how these ideas are moving on. For example, a lot of local governments insourcing services. So if you have a contract, say, for example, that's run by the public sector instead of G4S, what happens is people do receive the living wage, they do get paid holidays, the terms and conditions are a lot better, they can have trade union representation. And Lancashire Constabulary, for example, with Police and Crime Commissioner Clive Grunshaw, they've taken custody suites back in-house from G4S, I think, and we're encouraging that across the public sector, because the outsourcing culture that we've had in the last 20 or 30 years, it has failed. And again, that's something that we're encouraging. Obviously, Preston City Council is quite small. Our stuff remains in-house pretty much, but we're encouraging wherever we can with our partners. The Welsh Assembly, I mentioned about our community bank. The Welsh Assembly are supporting their own community bank called Bank Cymru, if that's spelled correctly or pronounced correctly. So obviously these community banks, a lot of different regions are looking at them. So you're seeing a bit of a revolution here, that there's 7 regions out of about 20 that are actively looking at having their own banking arrangements, which will be customer-owned cooperative banks, owned by people within our community. And again, that's to protect them from a further economic crash. Plymouth City Council, also Oxford, they're looking to double the size of the cooperative economy. We want to have at least 10 worker-owned businesses in the next 2 years, and we're working with Mondragon and our university to do that. So that's essential. These are companies run by the people who work within it. So there's actually democracy. So you think democracy just applies to when you vote. It can also apply to the workplace. And then also, there's also things like municipal energy, that Birmingham's looking at creating energy companies which are run by the council. So obviously that's cheaper for the people who receive the energy and the water potentially, because they're looking at water as well. And you've seen a lot of that. Nottingham has what's known as Robin Hood energy. So obviously you've seen the kind of like the behaviour of the big six energy companies. I mean, you have this very macabre statistic called excess winter deaths, which is basically old people who are dying at winter because they can't afford to heat their homes properly. Because you know, we're saying, and Birmingham's saying as well, let's get the council involved in that and other forms of cooperative ownership as well to actually challenge that. Then London councils are looking at community land trusts. This is very interesting because what it's doing is it's looking at land in which housing developments are actually owned by the people who live within them. So the land and the housing is actually owned by the community. And that means that the price of the housing, whether to rent or the mortgage, it's linked to the average income within the area. So yeah, so I mean that's something that it's an American idea again, but that's something that we're encouraging and we're seeing in a number of areas, especially in London. Because if you go to London, it's very difficult to get on the housing ladder. I mean, there's young kids there renting and it's £1,600 a month sometime for a flat in some areas, you know, and that does cause ill health. It causes stress. You know, imagine getting paid, you know, having to kind of like find that money from a modest wage. It's very, very hard for people. And then also crucially, this is really getting into the mainstream. So the NHS long-term plan, which I'll go on to later, the last paragraph of that says that the NHS should act as an anchor institution. And crucially, Civic University Commission, this was chaired by Sir Bob Kerslake. It's saying, well, if you've got a university, how can it employ local people, pay the staff a living wage? How can it buy from local suppliers and also do other things to benefit the community, reduce carbon emissions and all the rest of it? So these ideas put together, they're very much getting in the mainstream, and it is a response to the fact we've got an economy that's not working, hasn't worked for people for 40 years nearly. So just finally, obviously this is a health event, and that is the paragraph where it says the NHS as an anchor institution in the NHS long-term plan, and that's even under the Conservative government. And what it's saying there is there's places like Blackpool where 20% of the workforce are NHS employees. It's saying that the NHS spends tens of billions on goods and services, and it has lots of assets. So what I'd like to see is the NHS and the health sector, the public health sector, say, well, you try and recruit from the areas of highest deprivation and unemployment. Try and go into the schools and try and encourage people in the poorest schools to actually get jobs within the NHS. If you've got surplus land, why not develop affordable housing on it with social housing providers? Why not make sure that what you buy goes through the poorest communities and goes to locally based companies in there? Because as I said before, if we talk about social determinants of health, 40% of the reason why people get ill is the fact they're in poverty. And this brings the NHS back to the idea that it was with Bevan, that it's actually a social movement again. Because obviously it's fantastic, but it's a little unresponsive and a little bureaucratic at times, and it doesn't particularly look at itself as a key economic actor, because the NHS is more of an economic player in our communities than lots of the large companies that we shop at, like the supermarkets. And is it realising it? It is now, which is good. And again, that's another graphic from the Health Foundation about how the NHS can actually do that. And I think we've all got a responsibility to do that. And as I said before, I think the biggest challenge we have is the culture you get in these institutions, because there's a resistance to new ideas, especially around procurement teams and senior management. Sometimes people find new ideas a bit scary and challenging. But as I said before, we've got to do something new and something exciting that's actually going to lift people up in our communities, because if we don't, there's going to be too many communities devastated. We're in a situation now that, you know, poverty is on the increase, child poverty, in-work poverty is on the increase, and there's going to be real questions about the whole establishment at all levels if we're not doing something to actually challenge that. And this is one of the ways to do it. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you for inviting me here. Thank you.